Welcome to the Bicurian Podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Hello. Welcome to the Bicurian Podcast. I am Aisla.
And I'm Eric.
And this week, we are going to talk about measles.
Measles. So, in the news lately, it just seems like everywhere it's popping up, right? This thing that was declared eradicated in 2000 isn't eradicated anymore.
It's not eradicated
how
anymore.
could this happen?
It's crazy, right? Well, and so the outbreaks recently passed 800. And interestingly, they're continuing to spread. They're also occurring in both Washington State and New York, but they're simultaneous outbreaks. They're, as far as they can tell so far, they're not related, which is kind of an interesting thing as well.
Right.
So, so how it's occurring, they believe, is the fact that there are a lot of unvaccinated people.
Huh.
And to be fair, you know, they aren't entirely sure, once again, why it sparked in two different places at a similar time. So there's a lot going on. So actually, we're going to talk more about vaccines and the controversies or lack of controversies around them.
Yeah.
However, measles is the motivating factor for that.
We have deliberately misled our audience into thinking that we were going to talk about something not related to anti-vaxxers and vaccines.
But only for 90 seconds.
But
so I think we're okay.
Here we are.
We've reestablished trust.
So, this is a fascinating subject. And I think the history of it is really worth looking into because I run into vaxxers and anti-vaxxers all the time. And I don't think they really get like when it started, why it started, and what kind of led into that.
So there's some of the history there's obviously vaccines saved us from things like polio. I mean, kids used to get that and then not be able to walk, but that's not happening anymore for the most part, obviously. And then what happened at some point was there are some folks who were uncomfortable with vaccines for whatever reason. And that kind of spread. And one of the things, so I'm going to come out here in my community of educated liberals, there's a certain amount of contempt for people who are not pro-vaccination. And I frequently have had heated conversations with them. And part of that's based on my experience as a young mother, pre-internet, but still there's some internet going on. And hearing stories about...
In the 90s, let's just clarify.
Yeah, a long time ago. And in hearing stories about vaccines causing problems for kids. And one of the things that they talked about was autism. And at the time, there was a set of studies by a gentleman named Wakefield who indicated that the mercury in the vaccines was linked to autism.
Right. And that's the big famous paper. I mean, to this day, people are still citing it.
Right. And it's been totally debunked.
Completely. In fact, at the very least, it was chalked up to correlation, not causality, which, of course, is one of the biggest fallacies that we deal with in any kind of study these days, right?
Right. And so let's just give an example of the difference. Causality is when they're able to prove that one thing causes another.
Right.
Whereas correlation...
Breathing water equals drowning.
Right. Whereas correlation is something when you notice two things at the same time. And for example, one of my favorite ones that they talk about is, ice cream kills the elderly. Because what they found was that I believe it was Chicago, that more elderly people died when ice cream consumption increased. And really what it was that elderly people have a hard time with extreme temperatures and are more likely to be affected by a heat wave, which is also more likely to prompt people to eat ice cream. So that's kind of the correlation.
So there's a correlation, but not necessarily a causality.
Right. And that's what you're talking about with the studies that Wakefield did. Not only were they more correlation, however, I'll link to it in the show notes. They also were not done particularly well. He did 2 studies, and he didn't observe very rigorous scientific methods in how he did it. So there was a lot of opportunity for confirmation bias and just sort of sloppy data gathering in general. However, when I was going through this process, the father of my children had a form of autism, and he had really struggled in life with that. Like it can be very emotionally isolating, and at that time, it was even more emotionally isolating because we just didn't know very much. And I was looking at this stuff that people who I really trusted were telling me, and then I went into the pediatrician. My son was probably 18 months old. And due for another round of vaccines. And I was like really concerned, like, am I going to cause him to have some neurological challenge? It's going to make him feel emotionally isolated the way I've seen his father. And so I was trying to talk to the doctor about it, and he was pretty contemptuous. And so I walked out and was like, well, I guess I'm not going to vaccinate my kid. And so to me, that's part of why I tend to really struggle with the folks that I know that are so quick to condemn folks who have a different opinion. And I get it. Like, obviously over time, I got more information. I found that the study was debunked, and I went through the process of getting my kids vaccinated. However, I do feel like I might have done it sooner if my doctor had actually engaged me in a conversation about my concerns, about what I was looking for, and treated me like I was actually an intelligent human being seeking to do the best thing for my child, not a crazy person.
and I think that's the key here, because your story really rings in the idea that the medical community almost has a sort of high and mightiness about it that can be very off-putting. They know what's best. And I mean, let's face it, we all have a little bit of a desire not necessarily to go with being told what to do, especially in situations where you're now in charge of the life of another human.
Yeah. Well, and at the time, I was genuinely seeking to understand why people that I respected, admittedly, I think, they were likely kind of in more of a conspiracy theory place. I didn't know that. They were very much into herbalism, and I found for myself that a lot of those approaches to health were very effective. I also had the luxury of time. Like, for example, like Western medicine and the medicine that we mostly use to treat illness is very acute, that it treats immediately. And it, like, for example, you take an antibiotic, it's going to overrun all the bacteria in your body, including the good bacteria. Whereas like herbalism and sort of some of those treatments, they don't work as fast. So you have to be able to take some days off and like let your body rest so that you can like work with your immune system. So you're not going to kill the bacteria in your stomach, but you're also going to need like 4 or 5 days to get better. And sometimes we just don't have that. So I think both approaches are pretty valid. It kind of depends on what works best for you and kind of also what you're free, if you have the free time or the ability to stay home or whatever that looks like.
And there's even larger issues at work here. For example, they are very, very keen on prescribing antibiotics these days, and it's becoming a real issue because we now have MRSA. And if you're not familiar with what MRSA is, it is basically antibiotic resistant staphylococcus. The problem with it is it lives primarily in hospitals, and if you get a MRSA infection, you cannot just be given antibiotics anymore. And so what we're doing is we're making superbugs. So there is this balance, and I want to be clear that from my point of view, I see all of this stuff as a balance. We're bad at preventative care as a culture and as a medical society. Like, we just don't push that. And then we do acutely treat things. We treat it simple, like, oh, you have a stuffy nose, have some antibiotics. All of a sudden we have super bugs,
Hmm.
and it's a real problem. So there has to be some amount of that. The fact of the matter is, herbal or even just nature running its course, for the most part, you will get over a lot of those kinds of infections. They may not go away right away.
Well, and the other thing, and this is where I feel like the measles situation has occurred, is also, I once again, I was in a situation where if my kids were ill, I could keep them home and I could, take care of them. So I was never going to put them in a situation where they were going to infect other children or spread, if they did catch something that mostly was vaccinated against, they were not going to be a danger to public health. And it was one of the things that they do insist on. If you don't vaccinate your children, and you can, where I was, you could still send them to school. However, you had to make an agreement that if they were sick at all, or if anyone was sick with anything like super contagious, you had to agree that they would stay home and that you would take care of them. I guess you don't have to agree you'll take care of them, but that, I guess, is the assumption,
Sure.
right? And I once again had the ability to do that. And so I also saw it as a responsibility in that larger public health safety, right? Like, whereas, because if you go out and you're contagious, that the elderly, super young kids, there are people who are at risk for what you have going on that maybe your coworkers and your friends aren't, or your
Yeah.
schoolmates. And so there's this other aspect to what you're talking about. Once again, where like antibiotics can, if you're going to go out, you take antibiotics in 24 or 40 hours, you're no longer a risk to public safety.
Right.
So you have to also be willing to quarantine yourself,
Right. And of
basically.
course, we live in a society where being sick and staying home is frowned upon by most people.
There's a lot of stigma to it.
Right. So, we've created this world where we want the quick fix, and no matter what bad things are going to happen. But so here's an interesting question for you. What made you decide to vaccinate your kids? Because you eventually did.
Well, some of it was you know, I wasn't convinced, even though I had heard about the study and read what I could on
And
it.
you mentioned you saw it was debunked, so then you kind of
This was
opted.
before it was debunked
Oh,
that I
okay.
made the choice. It was more that i- i- I wasn't entirely sure that I felt that the vaccinations were necessarily on their own particularly harmful. I had some concerns about the timing and also just the amount of like stuff they were putting in my baby. And so I just thought, well, I'll wait, just let them get a little older where that, and I was a super, I don't know, I would say granola. I didn't give them sugar either. Like I wanted them to have a little bit cleaner life space,
And I think that's where a lot of anti-vaxxing um, propaganda comes from. And I call it propaganda because there's not much science behind it, and it's become more of a medical um, idealism
Hmm.
than even like an alternate idea of medicine or anything. It's not, traditional Chinese medicine or anything. It's based on an idealism at this point, and beliefs that have been debunked, but people still believe. For me, the thing about your story that caught my attention, and the thing I'm realizing now, is that what we mentioned at the beginning of the show was measles outbreaks, i.e., more than one person. And it would be fascinating, if it was, oh, that anti vaxxer family that goes to school with my kid, the kid goes to school, he got measles. Right. And that would be, oh, well, that might happen. Except there's enough anti vaxxers. We're having full blown outbreaks now. And the real issue is, I could see some wisdom in maybe waiting or whatever, but now during that window, while you're waiting, you're opening up to risk because an outbreak could happen, even if you intend to vaccinate them later during that time.
Well, and interesting, measles isn't one of the ones because when I had my children, they were actually given the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine at birth. So I didn't really get to opt out of that one, which is the one that was considered to be the one that was the most concerning because it was the one that, I don't think at the time it still had mercury, But that was the concern, was like, is mercury a challenge to the nervous system? And one of the things that is interesting, if you look it up, and I shared this with you, is they did find this one situation that hasn't, as far as I know, been replicated, but it has been authenticated, that the African American children in Georgia that were vaccinated with the MMR before they were 24 to 36 months, they had a statistically higher incidence of autism. And so there was some question of like, is there something about like maybe, and who knows, but there was some question around that, but that hasn't been replicated. So once again, like the Wakefield study was unreplicatable, and this was just a data analysis. It wasn't a study that was done. They just kind of were looking at, I think maybe because of the Wakefield study, some of these different populations. And then one place they found it possibly, they were like, statistically, there's like, this is weird. The ones that were done younger, bigger deal. So there was some recommendation for maybe wait a little for that population or for some populations, so that like if there is something going on, we avoid it.
Yeah.
Um,
And now that's become more dangerous because we've reached a critical mass of anti-vaxxers. I feel that there are breeding grounds for that to happen. So now you're not risking, the off chance that sending your one unvaccinated child to school, is relatively safe, because the good news is a whole bunch of other parents did vaccinate, so they're not going to expose your child. But we've lost that a little bit.
well, and the other thing is that, and so one of the things I brought up that I think is an important aspect as well is that a lot of times the populations that don't vaccinate are minority populations, and sometimes it's because they have a distrust of the health, government officials and health. And for example, there was a recent conference. It was called a vaccine conference, which it wasn't. It was an anti-vaccine conference in New York by an Orthodox Jewish population. And Wakefield actually spoke at it, and he was just like, conspiracy theory.
The guy from the original study.
The guy from the original study, and he was just like, I'm being persecuted by the pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you're just like, that feels a little nutty, right? And then on the other hand, one of the things that I was sharing with you around the situation with these minority populations and the government is that the government has done some pretty horrific experiments, and the most famous of which is the Tuskegee experiments.
So we're about to share a moment of history that no American should be proud of.
No, it's super shameful. It was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, and it began at a time when there was no known treatment for syphilis. And doctors from the U.S. Public Health Service ran the study, and they informed the participants, 399 men with latent syphilis and a control group of 201 others who did not have syphilis, that they were being treated for bad blood, which is a term commonly used in the area they were living to refer to a variety of ailments such as anemia. And they were offered complete medical care. They were never told that they had latent syphilis, and they were given treatments like sugar pills for their bad blood. And in order to track the disease's full progression, the researchers provided no effective care as the men died, went blind or insane, or experienced other severe health problems in the mid 1960s. One of the Public Health Service investigators who worked with venereal diseases, named Peter Buxton, found out about the study and expressed his concerns that it was unethical, because it is. And the officials at the Public Health Service formed a committee to review the study, but ultimately opted to continue it with the goal of tracking the participants until all had died. Autopsies were performed, and the project data could be analyzed of these participants. And so by the time the study was ended, it took 40 years, because this Buxton reported it, and it became nationally known, publicly known, and then it had to be shut down. Thank goodness. But by the time that happened, in the 40 years that it ran, 28 participants had perished from syphilis, 100 more had passed away from related complications, at least 40 spouses had been diagnosed with the disease, and 19 children had it passed on to them at birth. Now, be clear, this study, which is was a violation of the Nuremberg Code, established in response to Nazi physicians forcibly performing gruesome experiments on prisoners, because one of the basic ethic principles of that was that that it be required that any human participating in a medical study must be given informed consent before participating. Obviously, none of these men were given any form of consent around the fact that they were just going to be let to
Yeah.
have syphilis.
It is horrifying. It's a horrifying story. I'd never heard of that. I completely get where that would cause quite a bit of mythology around not trusting medical care, whether you're a minority or not, even. I mean, do I think that could happen now? No, but we live in a world where we don't think those sorts of things could happen. And yeah,
And it's not the only one. In 1946 to 1948, and you're like, why syphilis? I don't know. Someone out there might know. 1946 to 1948, the United States worked with the government of Guatemala to conduct a similar experiment on men, women, and children, or men, women, and mental patients, so from Guatemalans. And once again, to have them, I think what it did was it exposed them to syphilis.
and let's point out here one key thing: the invention of penicillin made treating syphilis easy, done. So, you mean, there wasn't even that we could find in looking at this stuff. And again, I invite any listeners to contribute any information they could find, a reason to study syphilis specifically or anything. It's literally a bug that does respond to antibiotics. I mean, there's a reason to get prescribed antibiotics.
Right there, because you can
So,
go blind.
yeah.
And so, and not to derail things too much, but one of the things that when the article about the Orthodox Jewish vaccine conference, one of the things that the speakers were talking about was a government conspiracy to give bad vaccines to the Jewish population, or to use vaccines to control the Jewish population in some way. And so there's this, I mean, obviously, Jewish people have been very persecuted, and we are aware that our government does on occasion behave in this horrific fashion. And so on the one hand, it's easy to, from the outside, look and say, wow, why are these people being so nutty? And then on the other hand, to know that like they're being exploited by, and who knows for what reason, but the people who are like Wakefield and the other folks who are leading the conference, they are fanning the flames of fear rather than helping these folks to understand what a genuine risk is and how to possibly mitigate that.
Yeah.
And so it's just one of those things, once again, for me, where I really did come to an understanding of, that my concerns were prompted by a combination of some folks who are being reactive that I trusted, and some, studies that were, badly done. However, what really confirmed for me when I was in that situation, the group to go with was the contempt with which my questions were treated.
Yeah.
And so I just feel like if you really are pro-vaccine and you're really pro-public health and you really want to work to like help folks understand the importance of vaccinating to mitigate things around outbreaks and these, diseases that are coming back like measles, really working to actually treat them from a perspective of they have some motivation for why they're there. And if you can actually talk to them as if they're, a human being rather than do it contemptuously, you might actually be able to make a difference, because anybody who had done that with me would have made a difference.
Yeah. It is, again, a classic example of a Bikerian thing. The people on both sides will be usually very passionate and understanding. I mean, whether you've had kids or not, there's got to be this abject terror of having a person's life in your hands, and you want to do what's best for them. And it's easy to just be, very overwhelming at somebody in a way about like, well, you just have to get vaccines, or you just have to not get vaccines. You can't. It's that you can follow both of those statements up with, it's too dangerous, the risk is too big, right? And just understand that, yeah, it's an emotional subject, and trying to convey the facts and not the emotion behind it will aid in any argument at any time.
Yeah, and just trying to understand why someone believes what they believe, and meet them genuinely in that, like being curious. And I think that we could see maybe some changes. So that's our show for today. Welcome to the Bicurian Moment.
So, this week, I wanted to talk about something that I found very interesting.
What's
And,
that?
well, they're an interesting band, and they happen to be in kind of a genre of music that I like. But they turned up in the weirdest place because we do live in a bubble. Turns out there's an entire world of things happening that we don't necessarily know about.
What?
There was a Eurovision music competition where bands basically representing their countries showed up. And the band from Iceland is called Hatari. And I'm not sure that people really knew what to make of them because they showed up in full BDSM leather outfits and suggestive things. And the guy sings with a gravelly voice. And it's basically electro industrial techno. And it showed up on social media. So there's a good chance that our listeners might have seen something about it. But I started following them. And I thank my partner for really turning me on to it because she actually caught it first and was like, hey, check this out. We're actually 6 degrees of separation because a friend of hers in Iceland is friends with them. So, but I was like, wow, this is interesting. They made it to the finals. And in the finals, they were performing in Tel Aviv, Israel. And they're kind of a shock band. But what they decided to do was wave Palestinian flags in Tel Aviv, which
Were they allowed to leave the country?
they were.
Huh.
In fact, what's really weird about it is there haven't been too many ramifications. I saw news stories talking about them, and they were talking about how shocking they were and doing interviews, or playing interviews with them where they're talking about how they're anti-capitalist and anti all of these different things, and they were trying to get their message out and on this, international performance platform and all of that. It was just fascinating to kind of watch how they arrived, and then I just caught and thought it was odd that like one of the most controversial things they did was just sort of glossed over. So, just a really interesting look outside of our bubble in this country. I like a lot of international bands. Most people do. I run into people all the time. They're like, "Oh, so and so, I love them. Yeah, they're from the UK. That is technically international. I know we all speak English, but
Do we
um,
though? I mean, I think if you talk to some people in England, they might
yeah,
disagree with you on
we
that.
don't speak the Queen's English, so
Okay.
that's a
That's
thing.
a distinction I can accept.
But I would advise our listeners to, take a look at that kind of thing and just check out sort of some of that stuff. It's very interesting to see what makes the international stage while you poke your head up from, you know, global geopolitics that are actually all taking place inside the borders of our own country.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thank you for sharing their video. We'll link the video. It was really fun. And so mine this week is the Rich Kid Revolution. I actually put this out on our social media a couple weeks ago, and it's been really interesting to me. This I'll just read a little bit about it from the article. A growing number of privileged young people, a generation, they're questioning the morality of their advantages and the social arrangements that produce them. And many are involved with an organization called Resource Generation, which is for people under 35 who are in the top 10% through their own or their family's income and wealth. And, some of them are called, honestly, like class traders, which I thought, that was just something people said weird in movies. But I
Yeah.
guess there is some kind of obviously I'm not part of the social elite. Sorry if you guys are going to be disappointed to hear that, but we're just sort of regular here. And so, I was like, oh, wow, that's some of this stuff. But some of these kids, it's a real risk for them in terms of, their social world or their families kind of rejecting them for their beliefs around
Interesting.
finance and money. And one of the women said the article was written by an interviewer, and she said, these kids or these young people, they know many others work just as hard as their parents or them, but reap fewer rewards. And one of the women she interviewed, who stands to inherit several $1 million, told the interviewer, "My dad has always been a CEO, and it was clear to me that he spent a lot of time at work. But it has never been clear to me that he worked a lot harder than a domestic worker, for example. I will never believe that." She and the others challenged the description of wealth garnered through work as earned. In an effort to break the link between money and moral value, they refer to rich people as high net wealth rather than high net worth.
Yeah.
And so it's just really interesting. It's an interesting article. I'll repost it in the show notes. But I really thought that it was kind of intriguing to see that they're really not, it's not just one person, right? Like it's an organization, resource generation. And they're saying, we think the world will be better if money were equalized. Now, obviously I think that, right? But somebody who's got that top 10% to think that and think, well, maybe I'll give up something for that. I kind of admire it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's absolutely no reason. I will be the first to admit I'm not an anti-capitalist. I am a pro-regulation person, and I think there probably is some wisdom. So it's good to see younger people actually not just taking what they have for granted in this case. I mean, a trust fund with several $1 million, if that's
Hmm.
what you grew up with, could be easy to take for granted, and understanding, wow, I have a gift here, or what happened for me to have this and other people to not, and really start looking at it, because it really comes down to, CEOs, while they're making millions, wouldn't even be so bad if they weren't constantly trying to cut costs and laying off workers, or cutting wages, and making life harder for their workers. And this is the beginning, and it's happening at the top too. I mean, I've heard a couple of interviews in the last few weeks, just randomly, within CEOs that are really, saying they value what their employees are doing and that sort of thing. So maybe it's a bit of a shift. You've got people like Costco, where the CEO takes what he needs to live, and
Well, he makes good money. He just
he's
doesn't
not.
make
Yeah,
ridiculous money.
exactly. And
Like
even
it's
just that, like, I mean, if you're paying them for their leadership to keep a multi-billion-dollar or $1 million company afloat, maybe they are worth that. Maybe that leadership is not a matter of how much, they have to lift things in a day, but realistically, you know, how much is enough, and how much could you be doing something altruistic as a company to
right.
take care of the little people, us.
Right. Well, and it was a like because I believe a Costco CEO makes something like 20 times what a regular employee, whereas the typical CEO it's more like 200 to 500 times. Right? Like it's just ridiculous, and it's one of those things where I was reading another article earlier today that said, they froze some companies. I don't know if it was one company, I didn't read it in depth, that said they froze 20 executives' salaries and they were able to improve the lives of 500 employees through that. And it's just one of those things like, and when they froze, I mean, these aren't people who are suffering. It's
Right. And
making,
and, and there's also studies that show that, employees have not gotten, like, on average around the country and even around the world, the cost of living has increased at a rate that salaries are not matching.
you're right.
So right there's clearly a problem.
Well, and one of the things I liked about this article, when the youth, the super wealthy youth talking about, this woman saying, my dad works, but I don't know that he works harder than a domestic worker. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, in that when I hear the rhetoric around taxes and public services and benefits and healthcare, there's a lot of rhetoric that's like, oh, you have to just work. Most people do actually work pretty hard. Even people that are, jobless and homeless, they're still working because it's hard to survive. It's just they're not getting compensated for their work, or they're not getting compensated for their work in a way that allows them to purchase what they need. That's the point of the public assistance. It's about
Yeah.
it's about recognizing that, in a lot of ways, it's like our friend when the cold snap came through and he had to drive to work because he was a tech guy, whereas like the the higher ups all stayed home and worked from home, right? Like
Yeah.
like you actually end up, the people who make more often don't work as much
And they
or
have
as
more
hard, and
freedoms.
they have more freedom.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a story that we have that really puts people down, instead of acknowledging, like, why should anyone have driven in the cold? Like, it was super dangerous. They should have just stayed home. There's no reason to
Yeah.
make it. I mean, public's like, fire, police, whatever. So I just feel like there's a way in which I appreciate her pointing that out, that like, yeah, her dad, of course he worked. And so does the domestic worker. And she's not making $65 million a year or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's an interesting concept, and something that I think as a culture we are starting to explore more. So it's good to hear that the younger generation is coming up, and even the people with the money are actually contemplating it.
yeah.
So, like to say thanks for listening. You can join our mailing list at bit.ly/BICUR, and get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bicurion.com/podcast.
If you like what we are doing, which we really hope you do, please tell your friends about us or share the episodes that you find most interesting.
Thank you.